Hayao Miyazaki and J.R.R. Tolkien are two of my favorite storytellers in the entertainment media. J.R.R. Tolkien is the author of Middle-earth, and Hayao Miyazaki is the master animator responsible for masterpieces from Studio Ghibli such as Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, The Wind Rises, and many others. Miyazaki is known to be quite the perfectionist when it comes to his movies, and his movies are universally beloved because he has these very deep values that resonate with so many people in a very deeply innate way. Politically speaking, it can be argued that Tolkien and Miyazaki are at odds with each other, because Miyazaki is quite an overt pacifist in his ethics, and he's also delved into some deep environmental issues as well as proper female representation in his movies. Take note, Hollywood. Because of Miyazaki's work ethic, as well as his friendship with his companions at Studio Ghibli, I have a deep respect for Miyazaki and all the staff at Studio Ghibli. Even if not every single film they made is great, there's no doubt that whatever project they make, there is an ambition to create a work of art worthy of analysis with every single project they make. However, because Miyazaki is such a perfectionist, he has a distaste for many other films because they don't quite allow people to think in depth as much as the films that Miyazaki and his friends make at Studio Ghibli. There are a few films outside of Studio Ghibli that meet the standards of Miyazaki's perfection. There are the films that influenced him in his younger years, and he has shown appreciation for films like Disney Pixar's Up. He adores that movie. However, for the vast majority of films that would endorse the very things that he detests, the very types of things that get people to be absorbed in constant, instantaneous entertainment, rather than the type of entertainment that allows them to think, Miyazaki disapproves of much of the American entertainment from Hollywood. And he has made himself known to have a distaste for the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy by Peter Jackson. There's an article that details all of Miyazaki's dislike. There is an article that documented Miyazaki's distaste for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I shall read it to you. Hayao Miyazaki named the Hollywood films that he hates the most. Article from the faroutmagazine.co.uk. Hayao Miyazaki is undoubtedly among the greatest living artists today, known for his seminal masterpieces such as Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away. Side note, those are two of my favorite movies, among many others. His contributions to the art of animation has inspired artists from various domains, including myself, including live-action filmmakers who have praised Miyazaki's understanding of movement. According to excerpts from multiple interviews, Miyazaki's dislike for all things American also extends to the realm of cinema, despite the fact that the Japanese auteur had named John Ford as one of his chief visual influences and even named his 1946 film My Darling Clementine among his personal favourites. He doesn't feel the same way about other popular American films. The article then has a quote from Hayao Miyazaki. Americans shoot things, and they blow up and the like, so as you'd expect, they make movies like that, Miyazaki stated. If someone is the enemy, it's okay to kill endless numbers of them. Lord of the Rings is like that. If it's the enemy, there's killing, without separation between civilians and soldiers. That falls within collateral damage. Miyazaki compared the visual politics of large-scale Hollywood productions, such as Lord of the Rings, as the country's international policies, attacking America's actions in Afghanistan. Miyazaki claimed that such projects are a dangerous addiction to public discourse because they diminish the value of human life by weaponizing the audience through cinematic violence. Miyazaki continued, "How many people are being killed in attacks in Afghanistan? The Lord of the Rings is a movie that has no problem doing that, not separating civilians from enemies apparently." Correction, Miyazaki, it's a movie trilogy. If you read the original work, you'll understand. But in reality, the ones who are being killed are Asians and Africans. Those who don't know that, yet say they love fantasy, are idiots. Throughout his body work, Miyazaki has conducted continuous conversations about anti-war pacifism, an ethical belief that has been deeply influenced by his own experiences. Miyazaki has often explored the paradoxes of pacifism in a world that embraces violence through his art, which is why these cinematic spectacles failed to amuse him. When his magnum opus, Spirited Away, became the first anime to win Best Animated Feature Film at the Oscars, Miyazaki refused to attend the ceremony because he did not want to support America's actions in the Iraq War. Even though his producer asked him not to speak about the issue, he later came clean and revealed that his producer had felt the same way. Miyazaki then talked about his distaste for the Indiana Jones films by Steven Spielberg, but that's a discussion for another time. Now, as someone who appreciates Miyazaki so much that if he called me an idiot, I probably wouldn't be offended by it. Probably, I don't know. Miyazaki is quite the perfectionist when it comes to his movies, and seeing how his masterpieces of animation juxtapose against the constant glorification of violence that Hollywood embraces, it's understandable as to why Miyazaki doesn't like the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson. Now, at face value, some of you might think, oh, but Miyazaki has war in some of his films too. Yes, there is war in Miyazaki's movies, but it's not shown in a glorious light. It's shown in the nitty-gritty way that it really is. And that, coupled with the idea that Miyazaki disapproves of Americans attacking Iraq and what he said about Africans and Asians being attacked, it's understandable to see why Miyazaki doesn't really like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. However, if you take time to reflect on what Miyazaki said, you might begin to realize that even though Miyazaki might have a point, at the same time, Miyazaki might just be missing the point about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, directed by Peter Jackson in his film trilogy. For starters, as admittedly flashy and epic as the violence is depicted in Lord of the Rings trilogy, there are many particular scenes that note that war is not particularly glorious. In light of what Miyazaki said, I can actually think of various scenes throughout the Lord of the Rings trilogy that showcase that war has its devastating effects, like when King Theoden mourns the loss of his son, and it's a very devastating funeral scene. I could mention the frightened looks on the women and children as they hide out in Helm's Deep. I could mention that one scene in Return of the King where a man screams in emotional agony as his sister is severely injured. Or how about that scene in Minas Tirith, where Faramir and his soldiers go out on what is practically a suicide mission, and all the people lay out lots of flowers on them, like Palm Sunday or something, for the soldiers to allow their horses to trot on, before they charge towards the orcs, with Pippin singing The Edge of Night, and Faramir's father, Denethor, Steward of Gondor, just constantly consuming all the food to drown out all that destruction. That could also refer to themes of greed that Miyazaki often refers to in his movies, especially in Spirited Away. And speaking of comparing themes with Miyazaki and Tolkien, the two of them actually have a lot in common. For example, the both of them yearn for a simpler life, and the both of them hate industry. They both showcase a love for nature. And both mention how evil can corrupt people into terrible, destructive paths, and how good can overcome it. The love of nature is relevant all throughout Miyazaki's movies, and the love of nature in Tolkien's Middle-earth is highly exemplified through the Ents of Fangorn Forest. The love of nature can also be showcased in how the elves decorate their kingdoms around nature, or in how hobbits like Samwise Gamgee appreciate nature. Speaking of hobbits, Hobbiton and the hobbit lifestyle and culture represent Tolkien's desire for the simpler life and his upbringing in England. Miyazaki has also expressed that very desire for a simpler life through his own yearnings for peace and nature seen throughout his movies. Perhaps you could make a comparison between Nausicaa and Samwise, that both of them are gardeners who love to grow things, yet are forced to become toughened fighters with the wars around them, respectively. What's preventing these simpler lives that Tolkien and Miyazaki yearns for? The industry. Both Tolkien and Miyazaki are very anti-industry in their stories. Both of them hate how the industry chokes up nature and creates congested urban environments. Both authors also criticize the very nature of evil and greed. Through Miyazaki, his critiques of greed and the industry can be seen in Spirited Away with the bathhouse, and in how demons form in Princess Mononoke, and in how some of his characters like Muska wants to attain power and have a hatred for nature. In a similar way, Tolkien explores evil and greed through The One Ring and how it corrupts characters like Smeagol, who then turned into Gollum. He largely critiques industry largely through the character of Saruman of Many Colours. Saruman had his own tower in Isengard, but when he turned to join Sauron, he created congested industry to hire and create more orcs. This in turn led to the destruction of nearby villages of Rohan and the deforestation of Fangorn Forest, which led to the deaths of many precious trees that were friends of the Ent Treebeard. The mourning of the loss of nature is also prevalent in Miyazaki's movies, especially in Princess Mononoke. Now, of course, there could be an argument made that Miyazaki's characters who endorse deforestation are often quite nuanced in their motivations. Miyazaki may highly disapprove of deforestation, but even he admits that there are people who are just human beings trying to get by in charge of deforestation. That argument can be made, but in many ways Tolkien acknowledges that too. Both Tolkien and Miyazaki talk about how greed, corporation, and industry corrupt people over time. I guess for Miyazaki, he often depicts people between that point between love of nature and complete lust for destruction. Miyazaki usually depicts some of his opposing characters somewhere between that line. Tolkien, by comparison, tends to depict his characters in extremes. And this is because Tolkien is deliberately depicting Middle-earth in this glorified, mythologized view which harkens back to Anglo-Saxon myth that he was paying homage to. Perhaps then there's a lot of comparisons that could be made between Lady Eboshi and Saruman, even though Saruman is depicted as more deliberately villainous, and Lady Eboshi is depicted as more of a heroic figure, even though she's still an opposing force within her story. The two of them do have a lot in common, that both of them used to be decent, good people. But both of them made choices, and both of them eventually became more hostile to the nature around them. And in the long term, they both get severely punished for it. Saruman loses his life over it, and Lady Eboshi loses her arm over it. Going back on topic, it's understandable for someone as pacifistic as Miyazaki to disapprove of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, yet Tolkien himself probably isn't the type of man who wants to endorse war, even though he'd advocate for self-defense if necessary. Whilst it is true there are characters like Gimli and Legolas who endorse having a fun competition over how many people they can kill, I should remind you, this entire trilogy doesn't shy away from the devastation of war that Miyazaki would critique either. Gimli's had his fair share of loss too, with his brethren and comrades lost in the mines of Moria. And there are many scenes throughout the trilogy which showcase the hardships of overcoming such destructive evil. This sense of hardship would strengthen bonds. There are characters who fight for simpler times, like the hobbits. There are characters who fight for what they love and cherish, like Aragorn. And it's through these conflicts that these bonds are strengthened. And it feels all the more authentic because Tolkien himself has also been through a war, like Miyazaki. In fact, Tolkien was deliberately involved in trench warfare in World War I. So Tolkien can authentically recount the utter destruction that war brings upon everything and the people he loved. As a matter of fact, if you look throughout Tolkien's adventures, they're not just about war. Like Miyazaki, they're about adventure, they're about camaraderie, they're about culture and the love for food and song and poetry and drink. It's about how tough times can bring about the best in good people. It's about how good triumphs over evil. And it's also about the personal struggles of the characters in between the fighting. And if you're willing to delve into the lore of Tolkien, there is a lot going on behind the scenes, which gives that conflict that much more depth. Now, of course, Miyazaki has also stated that Lord of the Rings could also be hinting at the conflict between the Americans attacking Asians and Africans. Given the savage characters that ride on the Oliphants in The Two Towers and Return of the King, I can understand why Miyazaki would make that comment. However, this comment can be highly dismissed once you realize this one crucial aspect about Tolkien himself. Tolkien doesn't like allegories. Tolkien's stories may have influences and themes and elements from Tolkien's own life and through the Anglo-Saxon mythology and his time in the war and his own Catholic faith, but he never deliberately and overtly showcases those themes. He makes them part of the story that he's crafting. To potentially go slightly off topic, there have been many people who have accused Tolkien of racism. However, once you start viewing Tolkien's work as more as an homage to the European Anglo-Saxon mythologies, as well as trying to craft a mythology for England, you begin to realize that there already is diversity within Tolkien's world. Much of Tolkien's narratives involve people from varying races, from hobbits, dwarves, elves, and men coming together, putting aside their differences to fight against a greater evil. You don't have to relate to a character by the color of their skin. I thought Martin Luther King Jr. made that clear decades ago. Although I suppose this whole issue can break down to one question. Are Tolkien's stories pro-war or anti-war? That could be up for discussion, but one thing is definitely But if you understand Tolkien, one thing is definitely quite clear. Tolkien and Miyazaki both yearn for that beautiful, simple life. The type of life that doesn't have to be infected by the evils of greed and corporation and industry. The type of life where they have this spiritual connection to nature. A simpler world in which selfless love, camaraderie, and eyes unclouded by hate can see through. Hayao Miyazaki and J.R.R. Tolkien are two of my absolute favorite storytellers alive.